All right. Um, so, howdy, y'all. My name is CJ. Welcome to the Immigration and the Left panel hosted by the Austin chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Um, we, let's see, the Austin chapter organizes, or the Platypus Affiliated Society organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s and 30s, new 60s and 70s, post-political 80s and 90s, and post-political 80s and 90s, left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. You can find the Austin chapter every Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the Union Underground for our social hour, and on Mondays from 6 to 9 p.m. at Mazes Hall, room to be determined each day. So our panel description is as follows. With Donald Trump's return to the U.S. presidency, many of the issues and discontents raised during his first term have resurfaced in the public discourse, with immigration mobilizing many in the face of mass deportations. But how has the left responded politically to the problem? How has the left related immigration to the task of socialism? How does the left demarcate its responses to immigration from the racketeering of capitalist parties? To investigate these questions, we bring the panelists here today to answer the following. How has the left approached the question of immigration historically? What opportunities exist today in the immigrant rights movement for emancipatory politics? What would constitute an emancipatory response to the problems of immigration? How has the left distinguished its demands regarding immigration from liberal or progressive parties and movements? I'll introduce our panelists for tonight, or for today, in order of which they'll be speaking. On my left is Martha Cotera, who is a librarian, writer, and influential activist. She was a major figure in the Chicana feminist movement and is best known for activity in La Raza Unidad, along with her works such as Diosa y Hembra. Next to her, we have Anima Arca, who is a local Austin activist with Anarchist Black Cross. Their logo is Brujeria was born in resistance, as revolutionary movements have always been deeply intertwined with spirituality. To their right, we have Rodrigo Villarreal with the Partido Nacional. And then to his right, we have Michael Woodson. Michael Woodson teaches English at Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and hosts 2 radio shows on Pacifica KPFT Houston, Conversations, a 5-day-a-week morning call-in show about politics, and Living Art, a weekly show about art and critical thinking. He has interviewed folks and done political activism around the Iraqi war, resistance, art to organize about choice, war, immigration, identity and justice, food not bombs, support of artists in war-torn lands, and serves on the Pacifica National Board. He's been with Platypus since 2017. All right, so the format of this panel will be that each speaker will give an 8-minute opening statement. Then there will be 4 minutes for each speaker to respond to each other in the order progressing to y'all's rightward, or to the audience's rightward. And so I will give y'all a visual cue to signal when you're coming up on 2 minutes. Just keep an eye on me and I'll just flash you a little too. And then at 1 minute, I'll stop you at your time, or I'll give an audio cue letting you know you're coming up on 1 minute. And with that, we do a short round of applause for our panelists, and then we'll get started with Michael.
I'm first?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you're going to get a history lesson here, because I think I'm an immigrant, so if you're an immigrant, recent immigrant, it just never goes away. It's just like, it's there all the time. So I felt like I needed a frame for myself. I needed to get a historical frame. It's okay, I feel more comfortable saying. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, I'm going to read as quickly as possible, because otherwise I'll ramble all afternoon. So as a child migrating to the United States in 1946 from Mexico, I was very lucky to have grandparents that had gone through disposition already, and then, here I was, eventually, I had to immigrate back. So they were grandparents that had chosen after the first horrible imperialist war that the U.S. waged against Mexico and took 55% of its territory. Mexicans were given a choice of remaining or returning, and my grandfather's family returned to Zacatecas. My grandmother had stayed in Chihuahua all that was native of Chihuahua all that time. So, and they both had been born in the 1890s. They had that recent experience, because 50 years is a very short time, plus the experience of fighting against the aftermath of that immigration. So they were fighting against the the industrialist, very exploitive forces that took Mexico through the dictator Porfirio Diaz. A lot of it impulsed by the U.S. or motivated by the U.S. Industrialists. And so they had that experience then as young people of fighting in the Mexican Revolution, which overturned that industrialist exploitation. So they were very well versed, and when I got ready to do my own, migration, by that time I was 9 years old, and I had heard all of this history. I was a budding socialist, I guess, at that time, because I was totally against exploitation of labor and local communities and extraction of the resources, etc. So I cried and cried and cried when my mother remarried and we were coming to El Paso, because I thought, oh my gosh, where are we going? They're going to kill us over there, or they're going to do something horrible to us. And my grandfather and grandmother very wisely said, you're a native of this continent, and like all natives of this continent, unless you cross an ocean, then you are actually migrating. As it is, don't worry about it. You've got background, you've got history, and you know how to fight back, because you've been taught how to fight back. From that point on, from a very small child, when of course I suffered the usual immigration things, people calling us. My mother became widowed 6 months after being remarried, so we ended up staying in El Paso and having to live like in a half basement. And so all the children are very mean to immigrant children, even in El Paso. And so they called us basement rats, and they called us all kinds of things. So my response to that was to get smarter and meaner and stronger every day. So these wise words served me well from my grandparents and made me start to research from a very young age the whole immigration fantasy that the United States lives. This immigration fantasy is part of the U.S. DNA. It can't go away, because immigration was the European settlement strategy for colonization and appropriation of land occupied by indigenous populations. Everyone needs a creation story, and a fantasized immigration tale is our story, and it's like our own creation tales, part of it we love it, part of it we hate it, and that's the way it is in the U.S., and probably that'll be the way it is forever. The Spanish conquered Roman style with organized military, centralized government, controlled immigration, so they could protect land and resources for the crown. The Spanish citizenship was extended to the natives, and the native populations, to a large degree, were very much protected by the Spanish, but the most Spanish government, for their own interests, for better extraction and exploitation, and in order not to let, even Hernán Cortés had to go before the court to answer as to why he had gone without permit, to get into Mexico. And he was deprived of a lot of the extraction that could have been his, because the Spanish government said, no, we're the only ones that can exploit people, not you. So anyway, the fact is that when these nations eventually, or when these people, in all of these communities, in 21 nations, in North, Central, and South America, drove the Spanish out after 300 years, they controlled their nation. as opposed to the U.S. where the native people control nothing. They're lucky to be alive today and growing. At the time that this whole thing ended for the Spanish, I was astounded to learn that there were only 450,000 Spanish citizens and Europeans in the entire, part of North America, Mexico, Central America, and South America, and Caribbean. I'm not speaking, not that I don't respect the African American community right now. That's another part of our immigration story. So I'm not talking about that. There was a very large mestizo, Afro-mestizo population remaining in all, of the colonies that had formerly been Spanish colonies. In contrast, the English colonists under corporate, religious, and individual land charters did not have the constraints of a central government, and especially after they became free. And so immigration to the new lands was permitted and promoted. And in fact, just to tell you what Thomas Jefferson said, well, there were many things. There was no, literally, no gun control. I mean, people had to get their own weapons because there were not allowed weapons by the government. And so Jefferson himself said, what we need to do is populate as much as possible by as many Europeans as possible that can come to the land. And there's a lot to be said about colonial policies, but one important policy is there was nothing in the Constitution, no enumerated rights or statements of fact about immigration. And so immigration has always been a loose cannon. You do what you can. And in the early days, control of immigration was more tied to control of labor mobility. And so that is another issue that became important with immigration. So there was control of labor mobility by local control. Eventually it went up to federal control, but in the beginning, and I think that's where we're heading now, to more local control, control of native community that was never a systematic labor force. Nevertheless, they try to control that. And of course, land dispossession, and then control of slavery and free blacks, and control of immigrant labor that was of different color, well, either class like the Irish or Italians, or of different races and colors. And just to summarize a little bit, Jefferson and others made it very clear that the immigration they preferred was European, meaning white, and that from the very beginning, these same discussions we're having today were had then. They didn't want people of different religions, they want different colors, and class was okay because they needed cheap labor. And again, from the very beginning, there was that conflict of established labor versus the incoming, cheap labor from the colonial period on to now.
I'm sorry,
Just
I have to cut you out.
I did my research on the left. And everything I have to say about immigration strategies now, policies, are totally in sync with the left. I thought, am I really smart or are they really smart? Well, they're really smart.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ani Manarca. I go by Flores as well. I'm a member of the ABC South Florida. And basically, my approach to all this situation is we got a very important history lesson that was given to us here. Mine is a more personal, yet very current history lesson as well. I'm speaking from personal experience. I'm not a theorist. I'm coming more of in the approach of first generation. My parents came from Cuba. And even in that, when they came from Cuba in the 70s and the 80s, they were immigrants. My parents were prisoners. They came in the 80s in the Maria Vogt. When they came here, there was a purpose for that type of immigration, which was to turn people of color against each other. And that was one of the weapons that capitalism used. Even though I was raised in a very what we would consider right-wing type of way, because Cubans have this thing about them that they're traumatized because they have a false notion of what socialism, communism, and anarchism is. So they tend to hold on to that trauma and use that against the left, right? I had to do a lot of soul searching. I had to basically remove that from myself and realize that I'm an anarchist. And anarchism is, in my opinion, the way that we can combat this situation with capitalism, and especially with the situation that we have going on with immigration. That's been going on, but now it's getting worse and worse as time progresses. I'm speaking about being first generation. My first language is Spanish. Having to have faced poverty at a very young age, being raised in projects, being raised basically where if you didn't know English, you weren't gonna get welfare. That's how it was. When we would go to the welfare office and we would see these government workers, and if we didn't know any English and we were confronted with them, a lot of kids like me had to be pulled out of school and go to these government offices to even get benefits. And if our parents didn't know English, they were cut off those benefits. Why? Because number one, they don't know the language, and number two, they can't defend themselves, and they're also being targeted and they're also being threatened. We've seen capitalism spread its tentacles throughout Latin America. We've seen how it is the core problem of immigration, because it has destroyed Latin America and has made Latin people come to this country, and then they destroy our shit. They destroy our country, make it shit, and then we have to migrate over here, and they get treated like more shit. So capitalism is the problem. There is no negotiating with capitalists. There is no talking with legislators, Senate, congressmen, anybody like that, because they don't have our best interests. Their interest is their pockets. Their interest is maintaining a job. They don't have our best interest at all. That's why I became a radical. I became an anarchist. Why? Because I don't have time to negotiate. I don't have time to debate with these people. These people have made it very clear, you're the enemy, and we're gonna treat you like scum. So what do? We fight back. We fight back, and we fight back hard. We protect our people. We protect every marginalized group there is with a radical approach. There's no peace with these people. We have seen how ICE is treating our people. We have seen how we're being brutalized. We're seeing how we're being described. There's no other way. That's simply it. So my approach here is that I don't have this thing where I'm going to be working with this system. I'm gonna fight this system. That's it. There's no other way around it. Especially coming from an individual who has an indigenous background. I'm indigenous Taino. I'm also Afro-Cuban. My ancestors have been enslaved, and they've been going through this problem since the beginning of when these colonizers came to the island of Cuba, to when my ancestors were dropped off in slave ships. And I've been fighting my tradition, and I've been fighting my identity against them since I was born, and my ancestors before them. That's it.
Hello, I'm Rodrigo Villarreal with Partido Nacional de la Raza Unida, or also known as La Raza Unida Party. And what we've been doing is, well, the La Raza Unida Party was born in 1970 in Crystal City, Texas, which is not too far from here. And it was born out of discrimination for a girl of indigenous descent. She was Chicana. And when the demands were met, there was a she suffered discrimination at the school that she was going to, and the community got involved. And when the school met the demands of the community realized that together they had political power. And being that there were 80% of the population in Crystal City, but the people with no political representation, they made a political party. And out of 16 seats available, there were at the time, they won 15 out of those 16 seats. And the political party was born, and it started to grow. And it, we went from here all the way to California, and there's actually members still in California now, New Mexico. And there was a time there was a guy that ran for governor here in Texas named Muñiz, and he almost won to be governor of Texas. And well, you may ask, well, what does it have to do with immigration? Well, the thing that has to do with immigration is that we're building political power for the native people of Texas. The native people of Texas, California, which all these people were here before the U.S. And we don't abide by that narrative of calling indigenous people immigrants. Like, I would not say that this gentleman here is an immigrant because his family came from Cuba. Why would we call somebody an immigrant who is of this continent because people from Europe came and said that we were immigrants? I mean, as you can see, the people who are being persecuted or being by ICE are not people who have Spanish complexions. They're people who look indigenous. That's why the people you see in the Diné Nation, the Navajos, they're telling their people they have to carry their identification so they won't get deported, even though they're not from Mexico. The people of the Lakota Nation, they're telling their people, their members of their nation, hey, carry your identification so you won't get deported to Mexico, even though they've never been to Mexico. Why? Because what it is they're discriminating against people. The more indigenous you look, the more they call you an immigrant. So that's something that the Partido is working with, is changing that narrative of calling indigenous people immigrants. And also working towards, it's an indigenous movement, like how you have in Ireland you have Sinn Féin, or in Palestine you have the PLO, well, that's what the party is doing, is trying to work towards political power to empower the indigenous people of all the tribes and nations from Texas to California. And I don't know what else to say. It's my first time speaking at a panel like this. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. That was good. Yeah, I'm Michael Woodson, and like I've been on the Platypus membership for 8 or 9 years, and also I do Pacifica, which is the oldest social justice network. It predates NPR. It's out of Berkeley, California, and it's pretty human rights centric and has been for 80 years. In Houston for 50 years. And then I teach in Baytown and HCC, so I teach a majority, what they call majority minority, which is sort of offensive in a way, because Houston is Latino largely. And anyway, so I have a lot of Latino students. And that's just the context of where I come from. And like I'm going to address a little bit about the framing of this in terms of labor and in terms of electoral politics and what all that means in my world. I'm on the National Board of Pacifica, and there's very strong anti-black racist politics from the East Coast, for example. So maybe some of this is my own context, where immigration and the Hispanic identity intersects with those politics is part of what influences my comments today. So, the question for me is about the left and what the left can do to successfully organize for socialism. And one of the big electoral questions, which may not be of such focus here, maybe even anarchism comes up, and electoralism doesn't even relate to that maybe, but this whole progressive narrative that we face with regards to the human rights of the immigrants, right, and especially in the guise of ICE as, being the current perpetrator, of oppression against immigrants. That narrative is something that I would address in light of how to organize the interest of the working class and of people everywhere with regards to effective organizing for socialism. So if you are following a narrative of oppression all the time, which is the progressive mode because it is ICE, right, oppressing the immigrants, then that's true enough. I know I teach Latino students. We started a new unit, and certainly all of my Latino students relate. You can see it in their eyes too, like going out clubbing and forgetting their ID. That's something that some of us don't have to be concerned with because we're not worried about ICE being in Houston, but they know it consciously, right? So, it is real that those politics are at play, and they are real, and they are a force in the politics of Hispanics. Then you wonder if the whole narrative is captured by that sort of reactive politics where you almost have to take the side of the progressives because they're not as mean as the other side, and that's where it speaks for labor and the need of what we don't have, which is like street politics as opposed to electoral organizing, where you could actually do something positive. And I know in my own experience, like I was at the 50501 during the Good Trouble days, and I talked to a group called Acción, and they were like, the immigration is actually kind of running without a hitch in some regards. They are actually processing more. Well, where do you hear that, right? So, to the point is, where is there a party which is providing these kinds of services and pointing out the impossibility of the party politics as exists under capitalism is providing that kind of help. So there's like this need to build consciousness that way. So like one of the things I'd be looking at would be like how they did it in history, say under the Second International, where the socialists were actually divorced from the government, but they were so big and powerful, they had to take up government, and the services that they provided and the whole intersectionality there of labor and social services and electoral politics and all that was a matter of strategy and tactics for the explicit purpose of doing away with capitalism so that that concept itself wouldn't even be relevant to people. And I hate to use the word capitalism because it sort of reifies the whole discussion, but that's my thoughts regarding immigration and what's beset the hard workers and the labor. And I really think that we have to give the consciousness of the Hispanic community like some different approach than just identitarian politics. And I'm a white guy, maybe I'm getting myself in trouble here, and I know about white-splaining, and I know about great white savior, and a lot of this I've got a little, like a hitch in my throat, because, I don't want to, organize like that. And so my question would be, if you're trying to organize something for a socialist party, is electioneering, politicking, is following the progressive narrative of anti-Trumpism and the problem with ICE the only politics you want, the central politics? It certainly does dominate the narrative. And also I'd ask, doesn't that sort of downplay both capitalist parties' abuses of the immigrants as you see it in the horrors of labor exploitation, the horrors of trafficking, the abuse of that whole system of immigration and the real lived experiences, the crowding, the domestic problems, like isn't that all kind of lessened by just following a single capitalist party narrative?
Now we'll jump in for panelist responses. So each panelist will have 4 minutes, and then we'll start with Martha.
Okay. Well, first of all, I appreciate so much everybody's take on this. It's all super important. What you said was just so amazing about, the nature of immigration for natives, and then, of course, the nature of immigration for everybody, Europeans included, because certain Europeans were definitely also targeted in the early colonial period and later. But I think we need to start with the premise that we have to look at immigration for what it was and what it continues to be. And we cannot ignore the fact that it was the process for colonization, and that dispossessing people of their land, period, stop. And that there was a deliberate and conscious effort to address Eurassian policy to exclude constitutional enumerated rights and privileges and powers for immigrants. That was deliberate, because this was a wide open issue, as Jefferson put it very succinctly. He said, we need to populate the country as rapidly as possible. And this could only be done through immigration. And the rationale that the founding immigrant fathers, because at least 10% of them were immigrants, used was that they needed to have cheap labor from the very beginning. Cheap labor, and the natives were not very easily, as you know, corralled into labor. Cheap labor, they needed to pay the national debt very quickly, and I think there was something else there was a third very important reason, but the main thing was populate the land and have cheap labor. So there was a deliberate exclusion of immigration as an enumerated right. There was in 1790 a very good naturalization process, but it was very controlled. Again, it was very controlled in some degrees. It was not controlled by gender, it was more controlled by class. So there were efforts then, but then comes the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, the very first act that mirrors what is happening today, that there's still a way to control immigration, control labor. And immigration cannot be divorced from labor. It's always been part of labor. That's why it's a perfect partisan issue for policy making. So I'm going to quit rambling and give you what I saw, what I think is the most important thing. Is in conclusion, and I will read a couple of these proposals by DSA, Democratic Socialist Committee. In conclusion, we should support DSA Immigrant Rights Committee that supports critical analysis and solutions, as you all mentioned, for neoliberal economic and far-right economic systems that produces immigration and then criminalizes that immigration. Because criminalizing, I was so mad at Bill Clinton, honest to goodness, don't ever give me a gun. In 1996, I could not believe when he criminalized immigration. On top of totally excluding immigration from WTO and NAFTA, you know. So I could not believe that. So the main, some of the main tenets of the committee, and I'm gonna add some of our own very quickly. Improved education, K through 12 and higher education on labor and immigration policies at the local, state, and national impacts, including how the government, again, y'all addressed this, has regulated mobility of indigenous labor, enslaved persons, indentured workers, and immigrant labor, and educate the public on immigration or relevance to current law enforcement actions. And we do this in Austin through Academia Cuautli at the Mexican American Cultural Center. I can't go into those details, but this is one, and this is something I'd love to see added to policy statements. Demand meaningful incorporation of labor unions in all trade policies negotiated by the nation. Needless to say, most of the time, labor unions are excluded, and if they're not excluded, immigrant labor is never included. They're always like, okay, like in early colonial times, they're cheap labor, and let's continue having it. And of course, you know, reform the H-24A and HIB temporary visas and others, and I think that putting that $100,000 fee is outrageous because it deprives nonprofits and others, including the elderly, of possibly, you know, getting some help from our neighboring communities to come and help take care of the elderly. And the NAFTA improvements, needless to say, NAFTA totally needs to be reworked to change the traffic reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, which criminalized immigration, did not take into account local, you know, border cultures that had existed in a very comfortable way, almost like seasonal labor. So people could come in and work, go back home, come in and work, and go back home. Support for labor unions for farm workers, definitely, you know, and again, I think that labor unions have, I guess, been too busy putting out fires, but I would say that every labor union or trade guild should have an immigration, you know, outreach component to do what you're talking about. Because we bring in new immigrants, and then the first thing they want to do, unfortunately, is they want to set up a right-wing government here because they're so, I mean, you know, no entienden lo que es el socialismo, la democracia, because they live under a dictatorship. And very soon, if we continue this dictatorship we've got now, we're not going to understand that either. We're not going to understand the difference between right and left and worker rights and people's rights or capitalism. So we need to make sure that labor unions address the issue and do outreach with immigration and help organize and do education with the immigrant community. And we definitely need changes for the per country, you know, caps on immigration, which is very, very, very horrible. Better forecasting to look at group. These are all proposals, by the way, by DSA. And that's why I thought it was so smart, because this is what groups that I work with, we've always proposed this, including Raza Unida. Raza Unida did a lot of outreach with other countries. And I've got a couple of other things, but I will wait a later time.
Thank you,
All right. So, the question is, how has the left approached the questions of immigration historically, right? Perfect. Historically, immigration has been used as a weapon for capitalism against people who come from other countries. Especially, we'll start with people who are not from other countries, like native indigenous people of this country. We could say that colonizers and capitalists have used indigenous people as an experiment to do what they did to them to what they're doing to us in this very day. We see that they made treaties with indigenous people with lands, creating borders within this own country. Then, when their interest got piqued into a situation that had to do with their lands that were shitty lands, then they kept breaking treaties, and they kept breaking treaties, and they kept breaking treaties like they always have done. They've always done it. They're not to be trusted. That's why I keep saying, let's stop making this situation difficult than what it is. The proof is in the pudding. It's in the pudding. It's in history. Capitalism equals racism, like Malcolm X said. And we go to, from an anarchist perspective. From an anarchist perspective, we have seen legislations being made against people who have idealisms to anarchism, Marxism, and communism, right? We see the Anarchist Exclusion Act of 1903, which was made as an immigration reform against people who have idealisms and have opinions that tend to be looked upon as radical or tend to be looked upon as a threat to capitalism. Then we have the Immigration Act of 1918 as well. Then we have the Red Scare between 1919 and 1920. These tactics have been used by capitalists to control us, to marginalize us, to basically do what they're doing right now, which is to label us as terrorists. We're seeing the same thing repeat itself over and over again. Anarchists, from my perspective, have always fought against immigration from the earliest times and has been here in this country from the people who came from Europe that came over here and started sharing these ideals with everybody else. And what did they do? They also got deported, they also got their house raided, and they also were not given due process. So anarchists have always been fighting against this issue that we're still fighting to this day, and they've always been labeled as terrorists by this very system, which is the enemy of the people, period.
I just want to chime in on what the sister here was saying. La Raza Unida Party did send delegates to different parts of the world back in the 70s and 80s. In 1980, Yasser Arafat recognized the Partido La Raza Unida, and he invited members of the party to meet with him in Lebanon. And there's pictures of that online where you can see members of the La Raza Unida Party in Lebanon meeting with Yasser Arafat. Because he recognized that it was an irredentist organization fighting for the indigenous people of this land. That's why I was talking about the narrative of calling our people immigrants. You know, we were here in the treaty that was broken in 1848 when the Chicano nation was born. Many treaties were broken for our people. And we had no recognition here. We're the majority of the population in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, but we don't have any political representation. It's almost like we're invisible. And Yasser Arafat recognized that, and that's why he invited members of the party over there. And that's what we're working for. We're not working to be part of this liberal system, but to make to work towards the self-determination of indigenous people of this land, and the recognition that we were here first, and that whole narrative of when Richard Nixon started calling us Hispanics in 1970. The reason why he did that was to quell the Chicano movement. The Chicano movement was fighting for these lands, these indigenous lands, to be back in our possession. And a way to muddle that was when Richard Nixon came out with the Hispanic label. And same thing went after the Mexican Revolution, Mexican independence from Spain. A racist French guy came over who was under Napoleon Bonaparte and came and gave Mexicans the label of Latinos. And he did that because we spoke Spanish, a language that was imposed on us. And he did that so that like that it would detach us from the land. Because if we're Latinos, we can't be called indigenous. If we're not indigenous, we have no rightful claim to this land. And we lose our irredentist rights, our irredentist claim to this land. So the Partido Nacional de la Raza Unida is working towards changing not just the narrative, but to build political power, to empower the indigenous people who are wrongly called immigrants. and all the other indigenous nations from Texas to California. We're working for political power and empower the people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting, and yeah, that's the struggle of my use of Chicano, Latino, Hispanic is well schooled, and here in 2025, I used to use Latino, Latina, Latinx, and now I'm sort of like that's shifting a little bit, and I learned something more from Rodrigo this morning. So yeah, the question of like this anti-American establishment, or call it anti-imperialism, is the question of really territory. Like, you know, it's an idea to marshal an identity. Maybe it's presumptuous of me, maybe I'm unschooled, even ignorant, but like, what does that look like when it succeeds, would be my question, right? Like, is it a territory? Is it a recognition? Something like that. So, like, that's sort of my response to the panelists. And I'm sorry if it's just my ignorance that doesn't know, you know, the material result of being recognized as indigenous, or the identity that we're fighting to realize. And then I'll just mention something about my teaching and my Latino, Latina, Latinx, Chicano, Hispanic students is Houston's very diverse. Like, I had a friend come in, or a colleague or a comrade or something come in to do a program down in Houston, and he said, well, I bought my Bowie knife and my cowboy hat. And there couldn't be anything more like, no, like if you don't know how diverse Houston is, right? Like, you're just not getting what Houston is, you know? And my Latina students would, I'd have them write about the I have a dream, being critical of the American dream, you know, from the Martin Luther King speech. And what I soon learned was that they were very positive on America, and that they were writing about, you know, hard work and how their parents succeeded and their hopes and dreams. So I always thought, well, I had one president of the school that I shared that with, and she said, then you're not educating them. But I always thought, is there political potential in this organizing with can-do, sort of American economy friendly, and on top of that, do you know what you are up against if you are trying to fight against that? Because what we all want for our children and our friends and our loved ones is for them to fit into society. That really transcends any politics. Like, your children, you want them to be secure, to have jobs, right? To fit in somehow, and then politics or something. Maybe that's just me, but I think it's pretty normal, right? And so, do we know what we're up against when we have to make our peace with the American dream?
All right, for Q&A, I think what we'll have is we'll just have everybody line up right here, and then I can stand with the microphone and then take audience questions. I'll go ahead and kind of walk down here, but if anybody wants to line up for any audience questions, I'll take them right down there.
I wanted to ask about, because I know there was a lot of talk about indigeneity, but also maybe the legacy of Spanish colonization and the American Revolution, right? And I wanted to raise that in some places in Latin America and Mexico, Columbus has sort of a mixed legacy. Sometimes, Columbus Day is celebrated as the day, as the day of the race, as the day that like modern Latin America like owes its origin to this moment. But other times it's criticized for obviously, all the injustices that were committed. And so I'm wondering, as leftists, how do we understand this history of the Columbus landing on America, the two hemispheres of civilization being reunited, the birth of modernity that comes out of that, and I'll just raise Friedrich Engels, who says that the reunification of the two hemispheres of civilization was the precondition for liberation and for modernity, because it was the growth of modern commercial bourgeois society and this international society that came out of that, and that Marx and Engels thought that socialism would be based off of the economic and social developments that came out of modernity. And part of that story is Columbus in the American Revolution. And so I'm wondering, as leftists, are we to just regret that Columbus landed on America? Are we to just wish that never happened? Or is there some way to redeem that history and to see modernity in general as something that is full of potential for emancipation?
Well, we try to rescue that, the issue of Columbus Day, by having the celebration as Dia de la Raza, and maybe the day that the natives discovered Columbus, discovered that there were, other people. I'm sure that they already know, because there's a lot of evidence that really there were previous, incursions into this continent. But I think that it can be celebrated as a first, one of the early globalist encounters. And if you read the exchanges, the food exchanges, the art exchanges, the exchanges with architecture, etc., it was a positive step for the world. And I think that our native continents are still defining, because we're not exactly free from colonization yet, and we're still struggling with that. We're still defining that moment.
Do any of the other panelists?
I was just thinking, when you're talking about modernization, I'm thinking that would be like asking the Palestinians to, why resist Zionism? I mean, it's modernization. Why resist fascism? Why resist the fascist colonial empire here that committed the greatest genocide in the history of the world, of 100 million indigenous people? Why resist that if it's modernization? Well, you could also think that Lenin also talked about the requirements to feel like what he called a nation. And the people here of this land, we meet all those requirements. The historical ancestry roots to this land, the heritage, the language, the foods, everything, the culture. Like, we have an irredentist claim on this land for that reason. And we have the right to identify ourselves politically and represent ourselves. I think we are a people, and we're deserving of that, just like everybody else in the world does. Just like the people in Ireland, just like the Kurds, the Palestinian people. Oppressed people have a right to stand up against imperialism.
In my opinion, I think that we didn't need Columbus coming over here to this side of the hemisphere. We didn't need any of that. Because if we want to look at things from a leftist perspective, whether it's anarchist, whether it's Marxist, whether it's communist, whatever you identify as indigenous people of Mexico, of the Americas, period, and even the Caribbean, we were already practicing these things. This just that the European defined it in a way and labeled it and put it in a way, but that's already part of who we are. That's already our culture. That's already how we are. We've already had our structure. We were already modern. To say, I'm not trying to disrespect anybody or say anything, but to say modern, in what context are you speaking about? A European context? Or are we speaking about in a context that is how we've already been doing things from the Americas to Africa before the European even entered these countries. We're already practicing a form of anarchism, a form of leftism, but that wasn't European. We're already having our way. We had our politics. We had our way of doing things. So, in my opinion, from what I've studied and from what I've read and from what I've experienced, and this is coming from an anarchist perspective, I feel that anarchism. I've had to even decolonize anarchism at times and really put it in a perspective of an indigenous way of seeing things, so that I can see things through my cultural perspective, my spiritual perspective, and then my identity as well. So yeah, I've gotten this system, and then I've also used what I was raised in from a Taino and an African Yoruba perspective and made it mine. So it wasn't necessary. I think, yeah, it's useful. It's useful as well, but it wasn't necessary.
Hi. My main question is, a lot of things talked about today were more about the lines of certain groups being essentially bullied or exploited by the state. And my question being is that all the demands made that, we want to be recognized as such, we want the proper welfare state, we want to be able to, the fact that if you don't understand English, we don't be mad at these things. Do we need Marxism for that? Do we need socialism for that? Like, wouldn't be able to take capitalism to be able to meet those demands and treating everyone equal? Be my question is, do we need Marxism for any of this? Do we need anarchism for this?
I'm not a socialist, but I like that. I'm not a socialist, and I should say, I support so much of the policy agenda, for example, on immigration, totally. I don't agree on everything. I'm more of like a social democrat, or, I'd like for us to have a system of democracy that recognizes the value of economic capital, social capital as in community, natural capital as in nature, of course, and labor, and people capital. So that's my take. However, I think as people, we generally, based on our values, and we don't talk about values because as natives, as indigenous people, we haven't gotten our philosophy together yet in a very meaningful way. But based on our values, each of us has, I think, a different take on how we see community. And I, for one, would like to see that balance, where you have everything that's important in our lives taken into account. Because we've always had economics, trade, etc. But we need to recognize the value in community and sustain that community accordingly. We need to sustain nature, which we do very poorly in the capitalist system. And we need to sustain people that drive the system. So to me, we need balance in those four elements. And we need to find a democratic system that will support that balance. And that's my take on it. And not I think free market capitalism is going to destroy us all. And it's definitely going to destroy this country. It's not sustainable the way it's being practiced today.
Do any of the panelists have any ideas on that question?
Yes, what I would say that if we want to make change, that we do need something that's not utopian. We need something scientific, something that has been proven to work effectively. And if we study anthropology, we see that our people here were a collective people, and that we also see that liberalism is a fairly new and modern idea, and all it has done is caused a lot of trouble around the world. And if we go back to collective societies, and we use a scientific approach. Yes, I believe that we do need leftist ideals, like what you were to answer your question, to make that happen.
My question is, I feel like when we're advocating for socialism, we have to recognize that what we need to push for is something that has not been done by a capitalist party in the past. So if we're not asking the question of socialism readily, then are we simply hoping to return to like either an authentic democratic party that means what it says, or a democratic party of the 1940s, or are we hoping that we can do something beyond them, something that doesn't simply reiterate those problems for other people on a different basis? Because the indigenous capitalist is just as much the enemy as the white capitalist. So how do we address this question? And if we're not addressing this question, are we trying to hold on to the idea of a world that can be free?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part.
Oh, I said if we're not addressing this question, then are we really holding on to the idea that a world that is free can be created? Or are we cynically sort of saying it can't?
I hate to be the one, but there was a time when I dreamed that either the Latin American Institute or the LBJ school would kind of, take this issue that's so important and use it as a study center or something. I think that, I'm not sure this answers your question, but ideally, when we get this university back to normal, I would like to see a study center, a center for policy development that addresses the issue of immigration for the entire nation and internationally. In the meantime, this made me think, today made me think that we need to start this effort now in the community, because if you don't start, nunca sucede. So, let's start this effort now in the community to put together a center for information, policy formulation, whatever, brainstorming, etc., to be ready for that moment when we can advance a progressive socialist agenda. I'm not a socialist, but I love the socialist agenda, by the way. Get it going. And I think that we can find places in the community to get it going. Right now, now's the time to start. Al cabo, they're hitting us all over the place. We might as well put something together now. And this center reminds me of the Y, and there's nobody here my age, but the Y, the women's YMCA, the women's Y, had a place on Guadalupe across from the Union where we would get together and where the ideas were born for DEI programs, for gender studies, and for CIMAS was already underway, but the Afro-American and Latino Studies departments. So we can do it. I mean, we can do it, and the sooner we do it, the better. And nobody that I know is gonna come and do it for us. And then that way, we've lost LBJ for the meantime. We've lost just about everything for the meantime. But that does not mean that we have given up giving birth. We can still give birth. We still have that ability to get something going now,
Rodrigo, do you have a thought?
I was gonna say that in a world with finite resources, it's not sustainable to keep a cannibalistic economic system such as capitalism or liberalism. So the logical thing is to go away from that and find which ways economically more left-leaning would work. And as like Maduro said recently, socialism is different in every country. It is always changing. You know, this had never been done before until it was done in Russia, and a lot of mistakes were made, but a lot of things were learned from these mistakes, and people evolved, and the socialism evolves. It's trying to be better, you know, and we just have to see which scientific way works best to sustain the world.
One thing that I wanted to bring as well, we even see this in Spain with the CNT and the FAI, when they had taken over certain parts of Spain, how anarchism worked in a systematic way. It wasn't utopian. There was a system. There was confederations. There was community involved. And yeah, even though you could see things in this manner, you could see things in this manner, and yes, socialism does evolve because it has that leeway for it to continue to progress and evolve. I think those are very important things because even within our communities and even within the indigenous communities, that was something that was experimented with as well. Within the community, we all came together, we put our input in there, and we all moved in a unit. So I just wanted to put that there.
I have to say that when you say we don't ever control resources, and very little is actually given to communities of color and to communities that don't have a lot of money to contribute politically, and in a way we act every day as anarchists and or socialists. Every day we have to look after ourselves, and sometimes we develop things by ourselves, for ourselves, that don't have any, regular policy behind them, and definitely no money behind them, and yet they're born and they're raised, and when they're going nicely with our nurturing, that's when we turn it over to as institutionalized programs to the community. And unfortunately, sometimes they survive, other times they're very vulnerable like today, but it's up to us to continue to protect these entities that we develop. So anarchism is something we're very familiar with because we're often left to our own devices. And that's why I love it in the Latino community when they say that if they turn Trump loose on a corner, he had no idea how to run a food truck. Definitely puesto, not even a food stand, much less a food truck. I mean, that's very complex. So anyway, I think by necessity, we know that route, both the anarchist and the socialist route. We've been there. A lot of times, unfortunately, we have to accommodate once we have institutions, and then those institutions that we build through that process become vulnerable, and we have to protect them or rebuild them over again. It's very distressful, but not impossible. We're surviving more or less. We still have the clothes on. They haven't taken the clothes away yet.
Thank you so much.
Unless Trump needs to build another ballroom.
Go.
Good afternoon. So, Marta Cotero, you made the observation that generally labor unions and immigration labor generally don't sit at the same table when negotiating. An argument can be made from the labor unions that these are laborers and we should find solidarity with our fellow international workers. A counter argument can be made from the labor unions that these immigrant laborers cheapen our labor and they erode local gains and national gains. So, and this is open to all of our panelists. What obstacles have you observed that prevent labor unions and the left as well from taking responsibility for immigration?
Well, I think it's a traditional obstacles from the colonial period, kind of like that DNA thing where, where the founding fathers, the capitalists, because this was basically a capitalist settlement process. They're all corporates. Anyway, where they did want more immigration because they did want cheap labor. And so there was always this conflict, even in the early colonial, and of course slavery, ese era todo otro cuento. So there was always this conflict between established colonists, unions or workers, and then the newcomers, and that tension that created a cheap labor force forever for this country. So this is in our DNA, and it's very, very difficult. I was so distressed, and have been, when the labor unions, go totally far right. And so I think that it's like processes like the workers' defense, project, and processes like that where people, again, they organize without the benefits of guilds, and they just have to organize because they have to organize. And so I think it's important for the community to do this, to work with organizations like Workers' Defense. And I wish that there were more like that in every single community in the nation. And so we all supported the Workers' Defense with funds and political activity, et cetera. But I think that, I don't know that this will ever be resolved, but I think that if the labor unions realize that a lot of people, especially from Mexico, come with that union background, to begin with, and if they did have an outreach program, and all of ifs, if we did teach labor history in K-12, I think we'd have a different situation. As it is, it's very, very messy, and people, unless they're documented, they don't find their way to the guilds and to the trade, union spaces. So right now, it's very ad hoc with Workers' Defense and nonprofits that work with labor. But there are very few. Workers' Defense is the only one that I've known in my lifetime. And that's really sad to say. But I think there's a lot of space for organizing. If we had, in our schools, if we had that kind of education, if we had it at ACC, if we had it at UT, but so far, as much as they complain here at UT, most of our institutes and centers are center to far right. There's no such thing as socialism taking over UT. It's gonna happen. But I wish we had better news. But for the future, there is a lot of still organizing work that can be done. But I think that people that have experience and power with the unions need to say, hey, you've got to do outreach. For example, the government unions at the city, they're so lazy. They just kind of sit around and collect dues. They really don't reach out to the new people coming up and talk. In the old days, in the 70s and 80s, they used to do regular seminars and educating people about the union. They don't even do that anymore. I mean, that's a problem, and I don't know how you solve that problem of apathy on the center, because I don't think we have such a thing as left anymore with the unions. I don't know. And that sounds like such a downer, but we just need to rehab the whole union movement. And I think we need to start like we start with kindergartners. That's the way we start in our program.
I think that, in my opinion, you had brought the point about how many unions have kind of leaned to the right?
Yeah.
But I think that we as leftists, as anarchists, we need to go back to the root of where unions started. Unions started in the left. It has a strong history in the left, and there is organizations here that are still rooted in that morale, in that root. we have organizations, especially like Black Rose, and we have and other organizations that kind of practice especificismo, and they go into these unions, and they go into these places to kind of like see, okay, if there is a union here, how am I gonna join this union with my ideals, and kind of get people to move to this ideology, because that's one of the important things about unions. Yes, unions could stay here or they could go to the right. But if we see that, and if, for example, with the unions that you were bringing here, because I'm not familiar with Texas too much, I'm not from here, but I know that from Florida and Miami specifically, and New York, when we have unions like that, especially the Teamsters in New York and all of that, there was people from the left going into these unions and organizing within the union and starting a group within there to kind of like move those unions back to where they started from. So yeah, there is there has to be accountability involved with the unions, but at the same time, we as organizers also have to take the action, start going into these unions, start meeting with people within these unions. I don't work with workers unions. I mostly do more tenant unions. That's what I'm involved in the most. I'm a tenant organizer, and even within that, when I was in New York, I was a part of a union. I brought that specific experience into tenant organizing, and I had to go even within specific tenant organizations and practice especificismo, going in there and try to be like, okay, you know what? I don't agree with this. These are my points. This is what I think that the direction that we should be taking for us to put back the interest and put back the interest to the people, making sure that they're taken care of, making sure that everything, that we're just not collecting dues, that we're educating, that we're actually fighting, that we're actually pushing these demands in a radical direction, so that here in Texas, I'm sorry, I'm from the East Coast, I have never seen in my tenant union experience there's a slumlord culture here. It's ridiculous. And especially within our community, how they're being treated. When people are coming from other countries, how they don't have to sign leases and they don't have to do these things. I have to go to these neighborhoods where no organization likes to go to these communities, and I have to start organizing within. And there is organizations that do kind of go in there. They do somewhat of organizing, but they don't hit the root of the problem, which is the slumlords, the management. And we start going in there, we start organizing people, we start educating them. Even if they're scared, even if they don't want to fight back, because they might feel like, you know what, because these managers, you call ICE on these individuals. No, we're there with them, we fight with them. We also take the accountability, because without accountability, then you don't really have a route to move on. So I don't know, I don't want to blab or nothing like that, but I feel like with with unions, I feel like we have to kind of like practice that especificismo with ones that are not really pointing really helping the people, and are just collecting dues and just looking pretty, and that's what it is. So yeah.
Just to repeat the question, what obstacle do you observe that prevents the labor unions from taking responsibility for immigration?
Can you repeat that?
What obstacle do you see, whether it's historical, policy, ideological, that prevents labor unions and the left from taking responsibility for our immigrants and immigration? And take your time.
What obstacle? I think it's doing outreach. I think that's an obstacle, because I think we're to reach the community and educate the community about labor rights, history of labor unions, and how people have benefited from them. Because I think there's also a Red Scare, and a lot of people who come to this country are, automatically think like, well, I can't adopt these leftist views because I'm in the U.S. now, and it's like the right-wing extremist country of the world, and we gotta abide by whatever the norm is, you know. And so I think the obstacle is that communicating with the people. Back in 2006, I was doing a little bit of organizing. There was a lot of guys called the Minutemen that were coming from Arizona. They were going to come to Texas and start harassing people, and there was a lot of marches going on, pro-immigrant marches going on at the time, around 2005, 2006. And something that we started doing is we started going to where all the day laborers are, where they meet up like at Home Depots or certain hardware stores, and they're there looking for work. And there's people from different parts of the Americas. You know, there's people from Cuba, there's people from Dominican Republic or El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, from everywhere. And they're looking for work, you know, they're just day laborers. And they don't know their rights. You know, we would go talk to people and tell them, hey, well, what's going on? They'd be like, well, I went with this one guy, he took me there, he took me to work for a whole week, and then at the end of the week, he said, I'm not paying you anything. He said, hey, well, he can't do that. You know, he has to pay you by law. Yeah, but you know, I don't have, you know, I don't have documentation to be here legally and this and that. So there was a barrier there that this person didn't know their rights as a worker of the world, didn't know their rights because nobody had communicated with them what their rights are. So I think the obstacle right now is probably communication and educating the community of what their rights are and how they can stand up for their rights. I think that's my take.
Yeah, the connection between labor and socialism is one of history. It's not a natural phenomena, you know? So when you're studying Marxism, you realize that socialism, as it understood the need to transform capitalism, identified labor in a very special way. That I think still pertains, or at least the question is still necessary. Using an old word, the proletariat, is the proletariat revolutionary party still necessary? You could just tell, like, this is so academic. It's not. It's the worst application, the worst context for the use of the word academic. But the question still could be raised about whether or not labor can be consciousness of an overcoming of what we call capitalism. Labor is in a deplorable state today, that's obvious. I mean, I've heard numbers as low as 6% set aside government jobs. It just doesn't exist. It's not relevant, you know, virtually. So that speaks to me why we don't organize the lower paid jobs has always been personally. In other words, why can't Starbucks unionize? Where's that energy? You can't blame anybody, it just doesn't happen. And then immigrant labor is clearly at a cross purpose with the well-paid jobs of unions. You know, union jobs, union salaries are threatened by what used to be called scabs, and I apologize for that horrible term as it's applied to immigrants, but the conflict is just sociological, if nothing else.
Hi. All of you have kind of identified, like, indirectly opportunities for your own, you know, activism or your own research or something. One thing I picked up on specifically was that you were kind of horrified at NAFTA, you know? And nowadays that's kind of in the mainstream conversation that like, you know, trade is being reworked at a pretty fundamental level. So my question is, specifically, it's kind of built on the last three questions. What are the opportunities for a left, for your, maybe even your specific you know, activities, to kind of influence or to, you know, make gains with this, the changing nature of, you know, labor, immigration, trade, And what kind of specific elements do you see that are under change or are transformed? Sorry if that's too academic, like Michael just said, but yeah, it's really
Just real quick, I think whatever power labor has, labor may be the only, organized institution that can work on trade issues in a meaningful way that have not been there before, so that the rights of workers on both sides of the equation, on the country of origin, especially organized workers, for example, we're talking about Mexico or Canada, that the rights of workers on that side and on our side are taken into account, and also that and they were not, as far as I know, organized labor was not really considered in a realistic way when WTO was organized and when NAFTA was organized, and that created tremendous surges of immigration. But along with that I think that a labor movement that would be more sensitive to immigration, and I think to some degree they're becoming a little better about that, it seems like. But if they would incorporate the outcomes, labor would be the best position to account for the outcomes over these treaties. What's going to happen to labor in Mexico, for example, or Canada? What's going to happen to labor here if these things are written up? As it is, it was a free fall, and not only did they close the borders and stop the organic, back and forth of workers across Mexico and Canada, but they also criminalized it at the same time, so it was horrible. And I have to say, the only solution is a third party, or more parties. And that's the thing. As long as we're stuck with a two-party system, both parties are going to cater to free market capitalism. And that is where I cross paths with socialists. We need more parties. We need to be liberated from this two-party system. And maybe this, having a dictatorship, will be the thing that frees us to act, on a party that represents the interests of the real people, that are vulnerable to the two-party system, because we're all vulnerable to this hold that these, both parties have on us. So, third party, or more, we need something like Spain, or even England. Well, England is more like two-party. But anyway, we need more parties. And we can start working now. I mean, don't go by our mistakes. We worked really hard, but we made a lot of mistakes. But, you can start working at these things now. It doesn't have to be forever.
Anyone, do you have a thought on that question?
I'll be interested in.
I also have just a very quick question. Marta, you mentioned that there were some mistakes that were made over the course of the 20th century in y'all's organizing careers, and so I was just curious what that might be, or what would you revise if you were to go back?
About what, sir?
The mistakes over maybe over the 20th century, or over I guess over your organizing
I don't
career.
hear very well, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
As part of being 87, everything goes.
Earlier you were mentioning how there were a lot of mistakes that were made over the course of your organizing career. So I was wondering, I guess, to jump in with a question, is I was wondering what y'all might have as maybe not necessarily bias, but reflection almost on what those mistakes might have been over the course of y'all's organizing career.
Lord, there were so many things. There's a lot of things we did right. For one thing, women can now rent property on their own, get a bank account, and other communities are also not as vulnerable on that basis. But yeah, I think one of the things we did do wrong is not coordinate the studies of immigration. Not to have think tanks that could address that issue. I think another thing that we have done is let labor shift, get away from from the communities that gave rise to the labor movement. I think that was something we need to call labor back in, and we need to demand that labor be more representative of, you know, young people, bring more people in. We have made, another thing is having multiple parties, you know, really supporting parties that represent the interests of the community. Not only the community, but those three other elements, because both parties represent one element, free market capitalism, you know. So I think, I would say those are three big mistakes.
There's something that I had spoken with Christian about when we were in the Mexican restaurant, right? Christian said, we were talking, and Christian said that the biggest mistake, and I agree, he took the words out of my mouth, the biggest mistake that we make as organizers, as union organizers and everything, is that we're not really listening to the demands of the people. We're not really attacking the issue and really giving them space to express themselves. With my years of organizing, with my years of doing that, I feel like one of the things that we don't do, and we just basically go about organizing and just doing it just, like how we said, Garete in Cuba, we just all wild. We just go in there and we go in with our perspective and we start organizing through our lens. But this is how we're gonna get individuals to basically organize and to basically start becoming part of the movement, is by really going after the issues that are affecting people. And it's something that he had expressed with me. We're eating together, and he said, you know, this is how people are gonna get involved. We have to see the issues that are affecting the people. We have to start working around that. We have to look at our past mistakes, work around it, take accountability, and then organize. Because with me organizing here, since I've been here in Austin almost 4 years, one of the things that I had to do is being a part of tenant unions is that I had to see, where is it that we're making these mistakes? Where is it that we're not doing? Are we listening to these people? Are we really involving ourselves in the situation? Are we really taking this personal? Because we have to take it personal. A lot of times we don't take it personal. We're just going in there with theory. We're just going in there with a concept, and that's it. And a lot of these individuals then just give up, and they don't want to continue. And one of the strategies that's worked very well for me is, especially me, I focus more on the Spanish-speaking aspect of tenant organizing, which is different than when we're dealing with individuals that just know English. There's a culture involved. There's a bunch of things involved, and my approach has had to change. I've had to even greet people a specific way, look for specific individuals that are trusted within the community, because within the Hispanic, Latino, indigenous community, we tend to look at one individual that represents us. And we have to learn that culture. And with tenant organizing, I've seen, even with union organizing and all of these aspects, I've seen that works very well. I've learned from those mistakes, I've taken those mistakes and I've remodified them so that it suits well for the individuals who are being fought for. So, yeah.
Rodrigo? I guess throughout the years, the party has had its backs and wings, and mistakes that it has had was like in the beginning, the party started because girls was facing discrimination. But then later on in the party, there wasn't a clear ideology of what the party was following, of a clear ideological line, and that also caused a lot of problems. But in time, we have been working to change that and restructure the party, and so something that we have learned from was that a lack of a clear ideology, and that's something that we have been changing so that we can move forward in the future, in unison, avoid sectarianism, and be a stronger party.
Reminds me of Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, the linguist. political voice, said we have to keep mindful of the advances we've made, and by that he's talking about the, how do you characterize it? You know, the advances in identity struggles. And I would think that it would be good to actually ask, are those advances, or for whom are those advances real? Feminism, the race struggle, the LGBTQ struggles, that's all fine and dandy. I would just ask how affirmative should we be on that score, on the politics of race, sex, and gender? And that's a question that we should challenge ourselves with.
It's a very quick.
Excuse me. Follow-up question. Marta, you seem to have pointed to how you wanted kind of a consolidation around maybe more, I guess, like academic or ideological cohesiveness. And while Anima was pointing to kind of different sorts of tactics on the ground and kind of a reflection on that experience. And so I guess I have maybe kind of a strange question of, it seems to me that there might be this tension between maybe like Chicano or Chicana business owners, like, or I guess my question is like, why not an orientation towards Latin American or Chicano or Chicana business or small business owners, et cetera, or professionals, rather than the working class? Because to me it seems like as soon as one wants to organize the working class or tenant unions and focuses on this aspect of organization, this tension sort of develops.
You mean when we start organizing and then they get successful and then they forget all about? Is that what you're saying? When they move up into the business and professional class?
Not necessarily. Maybe. I'm not necessarily. I guess I'm asking like I'm almost let's see, a question of almost like orientation,
Like what?
Like you were mentioning how think tanks, like there should have been more of a consolidation around the LBJ school, think tanks, etc. So then I guess my curiosity is like, why not then orient towards that aspect of organizing?
Around them, within them.
Yes.
Well, right now, geez, I looked at LBJ because I'm looking at all the right-wing components at UT, and they're massive, massive, massive. And compared to that, we have like a tiny sliver of resources, and they're trying to take those away. And those resources we put in place at UT, ethnic studies and gender studies, for a reason, to address the issue you're talking about, the issue of cultural competence and workforce development and development of business and union and labor consciousness. And you can't, it's hard to do without cultural competence. And that's why we wanted these centers to do. Well, now they're trying to take them away, and of course the powers that be don't see cultural competence as relevant to economic development, to professional development, to policy development, but it's the crux of the matter. It's the grassroots. It's what matters. And I don't know if this addresses your issue, but we tried our best to put into places and institutions like UT, you know, systems like this that would help us become more successful in addressing the needs of the community in the future. So we developed great lawyers that are helping us now, as we didn't have lawyers before. We've developed a whole slew. Not everybody is perfect or good to us, but we have the resources now to fight back that we didn't have before. But going forward, I would like for us to get together with groups like this and look at what we need to institutionalize now, going forward, to address the unaddressed, you know, issues while we protect the resources we have at UT. I don't know if this answers your question, but There's things that we need to institute right now, get underway right now. Because believe it or not, when you're in chaos, it's not a bad time to organize. It's actually, you can take advantage of that and put your energies to work there.
Thank you.
I don't know, I hope.
Or anyone, do you have a thought about that?
No, I'm good.
This question might be a bit more long term, so I apologize if that might not be in any of your experiences, but I guess all the panelists have touched on how immigration has been an element of class formation and has been used by the state as a tool to discipline the working class. However, some of the strongest anti-immigrant sentiment comes from competition with future immigrants due to the social relations under capital. So if the workers were to take power, like let's say in a dictatorship of the proletariat or something, what should a left orientation take towards the international division of labor and foreign policy, which creates the conditions in which immigration takes place?
Okay, these treaties need to take note of what the outcomes are gonna be, what the impact's gonna be on immigration. And to me, they don't do that. They also don't look at root causes of immigration. I love the fact that I have a nephew that studied in Germany, and he studied weather. I mean, he's a weather engineer. And he has teams that go to Central America to do remediation that on farms that will keep people from immigrating. I don't know if that answers your question, but this country is very poor, very inept in doing that. We don't do that. We just let whatever. Let's just do this treaty and we don't care what happens to the rest of it.
Can you repeat your question, please?
So if the workers were to take power, what should a left orientation take towards the international division of labor and foreign policy, which creates the conditions where immigration takes place? So just do you
But
have...
can I tell you about farming in Mexico during NAFTA?
Okay, but I would also like to hear
Yeah.
the other panelists as well first, maybe. So just to summarize the question, what would you think, like, a left orientation towards foreign policy should be?
Well, I think we should work together with other countries. You know, I think we should work together with other countries, and if people come here because they're looking for work from another country, they say somebody would come from another part of the world, and they come looking for work. I mean, they should be able to be recognized as a worker and be treated like fairly, you know, as any other worker. And I don't know, I'm trying to answer the question as best as I understood it.
I guess maybe if like there's disagreements between leftists in different countries, how do you think it should be sorted out?
You mean like if one nation has a difference of opinion on a policy?
So maybe do you think it would be something like the I don't remember what it was, like the confederalism or something else?
I'm not really sure, but I think that we should all work together.
Yeah, I know that within confederalism, usually groups that have disagreements with other groups, they'll come to an agreement. As far as I'm concerned, from an anarchist perspective, that's how it's supposed to be. If we have a community and we have disagreements with another group, then we work with that group and we come to an agreement. We listen to each other's things, and then we come to an agreement. We don't leave it to an individual to make that decision, but we do work as a union. If we have a disagreement with another group of people, we come together, we understand each other. This is stuff that is still being practiced in Rojava. It's been practiced within the Zapatistas. There's disagreements with different communities, and what they do is that they have a culture around that. Their culture around that is that they'll discuss these things within days. In this country, we don't have that culture here, because here everything is quick. Everything is quick. We have to get out of here within an hour. We have time limits. But in these countries, when they have disagreements with one another, these confederations or these unions of people, they make days out of it. We're not going to stop until this problem gets resolved, period. We're not going to do what leftists have done in the past, where if a group of anarchists or what's considered a communist go against each other, one wipes the other one out. You know, we have to come together. We all have a goal, and we all have to make sure that that goal gets resolved. And we see that in modern times. We've seen that with different organizations. Like I said, with the Zapatistas, in my opinion, is one of the greatest examples of what I would like to see for us as a people.
Hi. I just want to get at this question of the irredentism of the land. You said, well, we as the indigenous have this claim to the land, and maybe it would have been better if Columbus never arrived at all. We were doing things our own way, and that to say that globalism is progressive is like saying, well, the Palestinians are under the Israeli heel, etc. I would point out though that the Israelis are carrying out their genocide based on their irredentist claim to the land. The Jews claim to be the indigenous people of Israel based on, this religious ties to Jerusalem, the Hebrew language, etc. And they're carrying out a genocide based on that. And I suppose the position that Platypus would take is that the globalism that capitalism has brought about has globalized production, and it's eroding national racial barriers, which creates a possibility for international socialism and a universal humanity. So I would just say, maybe if we organized on the basis of labor rather than, each group, each racial group, whether it be the Jews or the Chicanos or the Palestinians, get their own Lebensraum, their own kingdom. Maybe we should just, instead of liberating Chicanos as Chicanos, maybe we should liberate them as human beings. That would be my question for you.
For me?
For both of you.
Well, that just sounds like assimilation, and assimilation is pretty much racism. What you're talking about, to me, just sounds like you're saying, why don't I accept Anglo hegemony and Western imperialism? And that's what I'm hearing. And I don't see how that would be making things any better by just submitting to the heel of the oppressor and assimilating into Anglo hegemony. I don't necessarily see that as progress. I think all people have the right to have a nation, as Lenin was talking about, and the Chicano people meet that criteria. And it's not the same as the Zionists, because the Zionists, they're there as colonists. They're there to destroy, whereas we're not talking about destroying anything. We're indigenous people. We're just saying, hey, we want to be recognized as a free people, not to go commit genocide, but to resist genocide.
And have always been ours.
I would counter that and say that the Jews claim to be the indigenous people of Israel, and they are carrying out a genocide based on an irredentist claim to the land.
Yeah,
but
they're
their whole ideology is based on white supremacy. They're not even Jews. It's illegal for them for a Zionist to get a DNA test, and the reason why it's illegal for a Zionist to get a DNA test is because they're not Semitic. They're Ukrainians. They have been from Ukraine and that area of the world, from the Balkans, for thousands of years, and that's why if you see them, you see all the videos or reels that you see online, you can see that they clearly look European, and the people they're killing and committing a genocide against clearly look Semitic.
And they're doing that same very thing. We could go to Israel, but they're doing those same tactics that they're doing are being practiced in Brooklyn, New York, where the Hasidic movement, there's a big Hasidic movement, there's a big pro-Zionist movement going on over there, and they're practicing those same tactics on the Latino and African American community, where they're basically taking them out, buying all of these things, using illegal tactics, and taking them out of their apartments and basically displacing people, just like they've been doing with the Palestinians. With all due respect, in my opinion, they're just using imperialistic capitalists. They're using the playbook. That's what it is. Just like how you have European descended people here who have claimed that they're calling themselves settlers. They're using that. Oh, I'm a settler.
It's a settler. Yeah.
What is it called? What is it called? Where they have that painting where that woman is flying, the angel. And what do they call it? Manifest destiny.
Yeah, manifest destiny.
So basically, like the Zionists are using a neo-manifest destiny, and they're masquerading it as they're indigenous people who have a rightful claim to this land. Yet at the same time, it's illegal for them to get DNA tests to prove that they are Semitic. It's just a colonial playbook. It's fascism, and what I'm talking about is not fascism, but resisting fascism.
Well, that's why we have to define invasion by immigration and settlement. It's still invasion. It's just a cheap and cowardly way of doing it, which is what happened in the U.S. It was an invasion, but it was by dispossession of the land, etc. And there are books that are addressing this issue. We've never addressed that issue. That's why we need an institute for immigration research.
And that'd also be kind of like saying like, oh, the South Africans don't have a right to the land because,
Right.
You know, the Africans or whatever the people there, the Europeans that are there also have a claim to the land. They should come together as a people. But then it's like, so that, again, it's like, so then that implies that the South Africans have to submit and assimilate to Anglo hegemony, you know, to colonialism. And I don't think that's correct.
Hello. My question's directed at Martha. Hello, Martha. So you've made it clear several times today that you are not a socialist, although you are sympathetic to the cause. So because of your unique position tonight, having lived through the historical Raza Unida party, what happened? Why move away from Marxism and socialism? What was your relation and Raza Unida's relation to Marxism in the 60s and 70s? And what does it mean for you to be a democratic socialist today? What limitations do you no longer see with the Democratic Party as you did 50 years ago? I have this quote here from a book by Dr. Armando Navarro, former RUP member, where you mention convincing people to move away from the Democratic Party and join the Raza Unida Party. And I suppose I'd also wonder if our representative today from the Raza Unida Party has any response to Martha.
My husband and I are founding members of Raza Unida Party, and we lived in Crystal City when the party was started. You know, I'm just I'm very practical about politics, and I oriented more toward policy than politics, especially partisan politics. So I always say that, you know, I'm not a socialist, but yet organized socialist. But when I look at policy agendas, they're more likely to be like 90% socialist than anything else. When I look at just like the immigration policy agenda is really good, really good. I have a friend, I was a member of the Freedom Socialists for a long, long time. and I'm friends with the founders, Yolanda Alanis and others. And if we're in safe space, I can kind of tell this story. It's real funny. So I wanted to start a chapter in Austin, and I don't anybody be offended, please. And I wanted to do that. And so we talked, and she was at my house, and we were talking, and I said, okay, so if I want to do that, and then I want to go beat up on city council about something, and I want to propose something, and I want to propose a resolution, and I want it to become an ordinance, which I do a lot, very often. You know, I said, well, what would I have to do if I had a chapter of the Freedom Socialist, you know, women here? And she would say, oh, no, you can't do that. You would have to run it through the, you know, through the committee in San Francisco and all of that. And I said, you know, Yolanda, I love you. And in fact, she was in my house just 4 months ago. I said, you know, I love you, Yolanda, but right now, if I want to do that, I can do that. I don't have to run it through, not even my husband. Well, sometimes my husband, you know, but I don't even have to run it through my family. I just go and do it if I have the support of the community behind, or sometimes even without the support. I just go ahead and do it and see what happens. And so I guess my whole thing is, you know, I want to be free to, you know, to do what I need to do in the community. Most of the time in consultation and with a lot of support in the community. And that's why. You know, and I was a founding member of Raza Unida, but I didn't always, you know, support just 100% everything that Raza Unida wanted to do, necessarily. You know, so I just think that parties are vehicles, and that, you know, you should have an open relationship with them, you know what I mean? Open relationship, freedom to act as an individual and on behalf of the community.
Well, I can understand where she's coming from as a founding member, and I'm glad you're here today. And as I said a while ago, somebody asked a question about how things that your organization has gone through and how it's changed throughout the years. And that's something that I mentioned, how when the party initially began, it didn't have a clear-cut ideology. And eventually, if you study the history of the party, just like many other parties, like Sinn Féin, there's been many splits, and the party evolved different ways. Same thing happened with La Raza Unida party, where it finally came to an impasse after a while because they realized that some people had more liberal views and others had more, they wanted to be more reformist, and they wanted to be part of the U.S. system and be accepted by it. And there was other people who took a different approach and said, no, we want self-determination of our people, and we have more left-leaning views. So there was a split in the party, and that's why there was maybe the views at the time didn't align. Everybody's views didn't align. And that's what I was saying a while ago, how something that the party grew is that we've been working on our political line, our ideology, to avoid sectarianism and infighting and work together stronger for the future.
Thanks to all the panelists. It's been very interesting. I wanted to follow up on that previous question, particularly on the party, because it seems like there's been sort of 4 visions of the party. And I think our anarchist comrade said, in some sense, we may all have the same goal. And let's say that's, for the moment, overthrowing capitalism or overthrowing imperialism. Let's say something like that. However, the path to overcome that goal is where the real differences are, like the trajectory that the movement must take. And Comrade Cotero, you said that you're now quite sympathetic to the Democratic Socialists of America, particularly an organization that you've probably seen grow over your lifetime from its early Michael Harrington existence in the 1970s through to now its sort of post-Bernie national significance. And so I'm interested to hear a bit more how you understood that particular party form, like as a sort of para-political, they don't have their own organized party per se, but they're sort of electing Democrats in various ways. Our anarchist comrade, you pointed to the Spanish Civil War, Spanish Revolution in 1936, and the CNT-FAI and particularly Espressifismo, maybe this is your particular orientation, a federation of anarchist organizations that could wield some kind of political party. Our comrade Villarreal, you mentioned that you're doing ideological work in La Raza Unida, but I think that you're a Marxist-Leninist yourself. I heard you invoke Engels as utopian and scientific, perhaps, socialism. I wonder if you are sympathetic to a kind of a third international Marxism, and this informs your trajectory of the party. And Michael, you sort of mentioned and invoked the role of the party, particularly as a labour form, a kind of higher form of labour organising beyond just the immediate labour struggles, more historical form. So to frame those four positions, my question is how do you understand the party as leading to the goal? Like, let's say we all achieve the kind of party that you might want, and it starts growing and becoming politically significant in the politics of America. How do you see its trajectory? Like, what is the point of the party? How do you perceive it to achieve the goal that we might all want? Thank you.
Y'all start.
Well, I think that we bring we do a lot of outreach and bring awareness to the party and what the goals of the party is. We can grow the party. If we have the backing of the people, then we have political power, just like what happened in Chile with Allende. And so, okay, we were to achieve a political power, what would happen if La Raza Unida party were to achieve its goals? Well, we would have dignified retirement for everybody. We would have universal health care. We would have better public schools. We wouldn't have our funding used for to commit genocides abroad. Also, maybe something that most people aren't aware of is that the Chicano people, by ourselves, if we were to be separated from from the U.S. and everybody else in the world, we would be considered the fifth economic power in the world. But you gotta also take into account that we are not the only people living in Aztlan. There's also people that are ethnically of European descent, which are allies. There's people of African descent. There's people of East Asia, people from India, Pakistan. There's people of, I come from Houston, like he was talking about. Houston is the most ethnically diverse city in the entire United States. So not only we would have Chicanos, which would be considered the fifth economic power of the world, we would have everybody else living here. And we would have, wouldn't need funding from the U.S. We would be able to, instead of sending all our money for war, genocide, or funding Zionism, we would be funding our own healthcare system, better schools, better roads, dignified retirement, and all the things that leftists strive for.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And if I understand correctly, an historical look at this would have a party which would help the movements just pretty much in an effort to transform capitalism into socialism, would help the movements stay out of their own way. In my reading of Marx, it seems as if he was constantly critiquing even the best intentions, because he could see something like that the immigrant labor and union organizing is going to necessarily result in like people having their own self-interest against the good self-interest of others. And it would really take a party to kind of like argue the shots that would need to be taken, as in calling the shots, as in a game of pool, not war.
Well, I just think, I was thinking, the political party was in power, like we had mentioned, and people migrate here. The migration policies would be completely different. So there wouldn't be this whole idea of, like, I don't know how we were talking about earlier, of scabs. That wouldn't be an issue because this would just be a worker, regardless of where they come from in the world. if they're coming here to work, they deserve dignified pay, dignified treatment, regardless of where they're from. So that whole issue of scabs, that would be gone. And another thing is we can point out is, like, I don't know if you look at China, with that system they don't have homelessness. And here in the U.S., we see homelessness in all the major cities of the United States, and it's continually growing. We don't see that they have that homelessness in China, in Vietnam, in other countries like that. In Cuba, they don't have homelessness. And they're also able to produce, like in Cuba, they have all this healthcare stuff that they give to their country and to the world. You know, they produce a cure for something. They don't charge the world. They're like, here's the information for everybody to have this access to this information to cure this. You know, that would be the goals of the party.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little, when it comes to the Cuba thing, I have a controversial views on that.
No, it's all good, it's all good. No, but you are right though, because I do also recognize as well that was necessary at one point as well, coming from an anarchist perspective. I think that the Cuban Revolution right now there needs to be a revolution within the revolution, especially when it comes to anarchists. Looking at it, because I have worked with anarchists in Cuba as well, I'm using Cuba as an example. Right now, even working with anarchists, them putting their views to the Cuban government, right? It's not in their best interest for us to express our views. So a lot of the time, there's a lot of repression coming from them towards us. This is not a Miami Cuban perspective. I don't sympathize with those individuals, but I will say this, that I do agree with a lot of what the brother said right here. I do agree with him. Healthcare is something that we should all have a right, that it's something that we deserve. It's something that we should have, right? Education. Cuba has some of the best education. Cuba makes some of the best doctors. But at the same time, I do also agree with the brother right here that he also said that at times we also need to stay out of each other's ways at times, because some of our politics might not coincide with another. In case Cuba, I've worked with anarchist organizations in Cuba. I know plenty of anarchist organizations. A lot of these anarchists had to leave Cuba because the government over there gave them two options: either you stay or you go. And if you stay, it's not going to be comfortable. I'm like I said, I'm coming from an experience perspective. I'm coming from experience. I'm not trying to put nobody down, but when it comes to how I feel that an anarchist movement would benefit people, would be, of course, healthcare, something that we all need. Education. Education is the key, because we get our people out of ignorance. We're educating everybody. We're making exceptional people in society, in our societies. But at the same time, understanding each other's goals and basically having our federations, having our things, making sure that we're on agreements and that we're also coming to conclusions with others as well, so that we can work and coincide with one another. Also sorry, Spanish is my first language, so I get a little twisted. Borrowing others' perspectives as well, so that we can include that and we could continually grow and continually evolve. So I don't know if that answered the question a little much, but yeah.
Well, I love, I'm supporting socialist Democrat candidates like Jose Garza, Greg Casar. Diana hasn't declared herself to be, but she was independent of the Democratic Party. So I'm supporting people that are independent of the Democratic and Republican Party. We're early supporters of Castro, early supporters of the Ortegas, and what happens with these people is that they have given socialism a really bad name, and it makes you feel very, very worried in your gut that you're going to support something and then they're going to turn weird on you, that they're going to be like total control freaks and dictators just like everybody else. And so that's what makes me leery of of getting into, a camp, because I've seen what happens when we are early supporters of somebody that declares themselves to be something and then they turn into dictators. And that's why I think I'm more of a social democrat kind of person, where I look at the balance of the four factors that I think our government should include, which is that, like I said, economic capital, human capital, civil capital, and natural capital, because that's what makes the world run. And but as I said before, my policies tend to be, the ideals that the socialist movement has. But I think the movement has proved that from the ideal to reality, como dicen, de lo dicho al hecho, hay poco trecho. There's a very small gap in between sometimes the ideal and what happens in the long term, socialist, with a long term socialist agenda. And so that's where I am. Not a Republican, that's for sure. Never been, ever, not even close to it.
Sound like an anarchist.
Yeah, more like an anarchist.
No masters, no masters.
At the community level, it's true. I said it before, at the grassroots level, we're all anarchists. Because we're all working on things innovative things that have not been created for the most part.
All right, we're running a little bit over time. It's about 2:06 right now. We'll probably just take these last two questions and then we'll try and expedite. And that'll be our panel.
All right, hi everybody. This is for the members of the Raz Party. You guys mentioned that one of the mistakes that were made in the 20th century was that there wasn't one consensus that you guys agreed on. And today I've heard a big concern about identity politics, but I've also have worked with Dr. Ernesto about material security. So if you think that a multi-party system is the solution, then how would we all come to a consensus on what to fight for? What does Raz fight for? And I guess my second question for the rest of the panel is, what if we were to frame a simulation in a way of having a labor culture instead of having the culture based on race, gender, identity, since those are capitalist constructs? So yeah, what if we were to frame a simulation in that lens? What are y'all's opinions on that then?
Well, I'm not gonna favor cultural genocide of indigenous people, because I think that in itself is cultural, capitalist culture, is to erase people's cultures and just make them submit to the, capitalism.
Well, so my question isn't really based on race, though. It's like our cultures are going to have to interact with each other anyway. That is a stage that we're going to have to go through. But to frame it in a different lens, rather not anything based on politics or identity or culture that are capitalist structures, what if we were to just phrase a simulation as just a labor culture? So we identify as workers, not rather as like Chicano or white, black, Mexican. So would y'all be more open to the idea of simulation then? So that way we could all have a goal and identity to fight on, since that was a mistake made in the 20th century by y'all's own words.
Well, I just think that that's something that's not negotiable. Just like the Palestinian people are not going to give up their heritage or their culture in order to be accepted by Zionism. Rejecting our culture is genocide. So that's not negotiable. We're indigenous people, and I think the Kurds are people, and I think the people of Ireland deserve, for their culture to be respected. The Aboriginal people of Australia, I think they deserve a recognition, other than to say, hey, the people of Australia should just forget who they are, forget their ancestry and their heritage and their ties to Australia, and just become workers. And then what are you saying by that? For them to to commit cultural genocide on themselves and just accept the Anglo hegemony that Australia has imposed on them and just say, hey, we're just workers now.
Well, so my understanding of politics and like parties is that they spawn out of necessity. They spawn out of necessity, so they're symptoms of the oppression that was brought on by the ruling class. So in America specifically, we're working on absolutely nothing. We don't have a workers' like political identity. Like we have bras, but that's really only it's not really only benefiting, but towards the majority of America, that's really not very inclusive. So that we could say that, like, yeah, everyone can join, but with no historical memory, which is what we're working with currently, that's not going to look like that to the rest of the labor parties. So I'm not saying to erase our culture, but political parties historically have only spawned out of necessity. So I think a good stage is to at least identify first as workers. So that's not exactly conceding, but in order to progress, sometimes we do have to kind of take a step back a little bit. So in that framework, assimilation in that framework, not exactly rejecting our culture and what happened to our people, but to identify as workers with the rest of the country, which is made up of millions of, or like thousands of different types of cultures and languages. Would you guys go forward using that framework?
Well, La Raza Unida Party does have a labor committee, and it's actually not even led by a Chicano or a person of indigenous Native American descent. It's led by a Filipino person. So La Raza Unida Party has Filipino members. We have African American members. We have people of different ethnicities, but they understand that this is, like you said, a need that needs to be addressed, and that's what the party's trying to do, is to address the reality that we don't have representation, and that we deserve that. And so the party is invested in, like what you're talking about, labor union. We have a labor committee, so that is a part of the party. It is a part of the structure, but we're not gonna negate our indigenous identity in the process.
I think a labor party would be phenomenal. And I think there's a small framework for that, template for that, and that's the women's movement. As much as the people that we entrusted the movement to let it down in the last decades, I think the women's mainstream movement was very successful in achieving policy goals that we set out to achieve, and it was very successful in working as a gender, and as an example for labor, as a class party. I think it's a good example because we were able to come together with women from all classes, but also all ethnicities and races. And we were able to achieve most of the issues that, the most important issues at the national level. Unfortunately, like with a lot of movements, when the most powerful within the movement, ascended to office, people like Hillary Clinton and the leaders of now, et cetera, ascended, then their personal power became more important than the movement itself, and we should have from the very beginning perhaps organized into a party, and so I would support a labor party, 100%, and I would support the Raza Unida Party. I don't think they're exclusive.
Well, we are
like
about labor.
I'm a supporter of multiple parties.
We're about labor.
And yeah, I know Raza Unida has always had a labor component, but what I'm saying that if labor wanted to organize a labor party, I think that it would be powerful in this country, and I think it would be successful. And there are labor parties in other countries.
Thank you.
Hello. I only moved to Texas not so long ago, so forgive me if my kind of political knowledge and all this is a bit lacking. So there's been lots of talk today about self-determination and irredentist movements for indigenous and Chicano people. And my question is, there's lots of discussion about maintaining workers' rights in said state following independence and that kind of thing. So my question is, ultimately, upon independence, you're mentioning that it'd be the fifth economic, I forgot the exact word that was being used, but it'd be economically very powerful and important, right? When you do ultimately have immigration, because if you are respecting workers' rights and all these different things that attract people to said state, how would you differentiate from the states that we see now who have these archaic immigration policies and stuff? And then even then, when you ultimately have people who are moving, who are of different backgrounds and that kind of thing, what would the expectation be culturally? I guess, would you expect cultural assimilation? And then, or would they be able to maintain their own culture within the confines of that? I'm trying to get a deeper understanding of how this would all work in just practical terms.
Well, what I was saying is not theoretic. It's already been. You can look it up online. That the Chicano people are right now. We are. If we were to be separate already, we are the fifth economic power of the world. And but like I said, there's other people here. It's not just us. And that'll make this region of the world even stronger, more than fifth place, economically. And so we wouldn't need funding from the U.S. We would not be a poor country. We'd be able to work with other countries of the world. But also you're asking about what if somebody else came? Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, they would be workers and they would be recognized as such. They would get the same treatment as any other worker. I guess you could say our policy is not about, this government was built on the U.S. government was built on white supremacy. So it's trying to ethnically cleanse of indigenous people, of Chicanos people. People that are born and raised here, people like me, I'm under the threat of being deported just because of how I look. But people who are there's in the southeast coast of the U.S., there's Russian ghettos, there's Irish ghettos, there's British ghettos, and none of those ghettos are being attacked by ICE. They're not being kicked out. They're not being ethnically cleansed. You know what I mean? So our policy says we are not a colonial system. We're an irredentist system where indigenous people are trying to achieve liberation. Our main focus is not to oppress other people. It would not be like, oh, well, you're not. It's like, for example, Mexico. Mexico achieved independence from Spain. But in Mexico, there's a lot of Japanese people, there's a lot of Chinese people, there's a lot of Korean people, there's Russian people, there's a lot of people from Europe, and they all live there, and nobody there is treating them differently because they're there. They just work.
Yeah, so I guess over time, there would eventually be shifts in demographics, right? Especially if the state, as I'm kind of understanding, I don't want to use the word ethno-state, but there is an element if it's for a specific group, it does kind of start leaning.
Well, if you think, like I said, Mexico fought for its independence as an ethnic group, trying to free itself from the clutches of European imperialism known as Spain.
Yeah.
Okay. But the very first or second president of Mexico was of Afro-American descent. They were African descent. So nobody there was saying, oh, this is an indigenous country. Mexico itself is an indigenous word. It's a Native American word based on the Mexica people. Nobody said, hey, well, this guy is African, so he can't be the president. There have been, right now, the current president of Mexico is loved by the entire nation of Mexico, and she is of Ashkenazi descent. And nobody is attacking her because she is not of indigenous DNA. Nobody's doing that. And Peru is also another country like Mexico, which is ethnically an indigenous country. If you go to Peru, you see that the majority of the people look indigenous. But for a while, they had a president of Japanese descent. Yeah, so it would be the same here. Like I said, there's members in the party that are not necessarily Chicano. you could be a member. You could join today. And as a matter of fact, I invite all of you to join the party today. You can get on the website and there's a membership form and you can click on there and you can join the party today if you want to support what we're trying to work for.
Okay. Thank you.
From an
Your
sorry.
question tells me that you should be one of the ones to start the research initiative because you covered all the entities that we need to cover in an immigration research center, a really good center. And I have to say what he explained, I think is the fact that in other countries, the identity of the citizens is their nationality. You know, they are English or they're from England or whatever, they're English citizens. In Mexico, you know, son ciudadanos, todo mundo ciudadano mexicano. But here, it's not by citizenship, it's by ethnicity, by race. And so your first identifier is by race. So when we defend, you know, our identity, we're following what is the custom here. You know, that everybody has a racial designation. And probably that's very unfortunate and bad because of our immigration DNA in the founding of the nation, and that's what occurred. Now, I don't know if we'll ever get beyond that, but people that complain about that don't realize that this is the identity that is imposed on people in this country. There is no real national identity. I mean, they don't even take the fact that you say, well, I'm a U.S. citizen. Oh, yeah? Well, you don't look like it. You look like Mexican. So what do they want me to do, you know? They put you in this situation, and the law does this. So that, I don't know, that's a long way around, but that's why identity in this country, it is the first identifier, never nationality.
In Mexico,
but you can start the immigration center.
In Mexico, we have a prime example of how anarchists work together within a community. In Tijuana, Mexico, there's the organization Enclave. Enclave is an anarchist organization that what happens is that Tijuana is one of those places where people stay stuck. When people are migrating from other countries, they stay stuck right there.
Yeah.
Enclave being one of those anarchist organizations, what do they do? It doesn't matter if you're Haitian, it doesn't matter wherever you're from. It's a community effort. Everybody's working as a community to reach their goal. And that's how it is. It doesn't matter where you're from. And that's just one little example. That's just a small example that how these countries are and how they see these things and how they work together. So somebody like yourself goes to Mexico and you go to this community, you're a part of the community. So that was just a small example.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for our panelists. This concludes our panel. Round of applause.